Welcome to the Spring Boot 0 to Infinity course. So this is going to be the second video of this series. So what we have already covered. So in the first video we have already covered about why framework, Spring ecosystem and the real world use cases. So we are currently learning about the Spring core concepts. In the Spring core concepts, we have already learned about the why framework, why there is need of framework, what is framework, and what is the Spring ecosystem and its real world use cases, and what is meant by the inversion of control in the previous video. So in the today's video, our focus is going to be the understanding one of the very important concept of the Spring, that is the Spring context and the beans. So what we are going to learn in today's video. So in today's video, we are going to learn about the Spring context, beans, and its life cycle. This is going to be the one of the very important concept of the Spring Boot. So what we will learn in today's video. So in today's video, first we will learn about what is the Spring context. Then we will learn about what is beans, how Spring create and the manage bean, different ways of creating the beans, like using bean annotation, stereotype annotation, and how we can create the beans programmatically. Then we will learn about the complete bean life cycle. We will look at overview about the bean life cycle, and we will learn the complete bean life cycle. After, we will learn about the dependency injection in the next video. Next, we will learn about the real world analogy for easy understanding. So after this video, you will clearly understand how Spring works internally, because in order to build the foundation of the Spring, this is one of the most needed concept, Spring context and the beans. This is foundation for the Spring and the Spring Boot. So let's start with the Spring context. This is going to be one of the very important concept of the Spring and the Spring Boot. It is the foundation. We can say that Spring context is the foundation for the Spring or Spring Boot. So what is a Spring context? So we can consider the Spring context as nothing but as a place in the memory of our app in which we add all the object instance that we want the framework to manage. So Spring context is what? Spring context is a place in our memory. It is, we can consider it as a place in our memory where we add all the object instance that we want our framework to manage. Have you understand? So by default, Spring does not know any of the object we define in our application. So to enable the Spring to know our object, we need to add it to the context. So have you understand? So Spring context is nothing. It is a place in the memory of our app in which we add all the object instance that we want our framework to manage, and it provides a different functionality to that objects. So what is a Spring context? Spring context is nothing. It is a place in the memory where it is a place in memory of our application where we add all the instance of our object that we want our framework to manage. For example, and by default, the Spring does not know any object that are defined in our application. Spring know only about that object that are added to the context. So we can consider Spring as a place, centralized place in our memory from where the Spring framework added some functionality to this object. So now you will be wondering, like, okay, the Spring context is a place in the memory where we add all the object that we want our framework to manage. So basically, why we should add the object instance to the context? Why should we add the object instance to the context, the Spring context? So basically, when an object is added to the Spring context, Spring takes the control and provide different functionality. So basically, when we add the Spring object to the Spring context, Spring take the full control of that object and it provides the different functionalities. Some of the functionalities like the AOP, aspect oriented programming, dependency injection. We will learn about this in the upcoming videos. So basically, when we add this object to the Spring context, Spring take the full control of that object and provide the different functionality. For example, when we add this object to the Spring context, it will create the object for us. We don't need to create the object using the new keyword. Spring will create the object for us. It will inject the required dependency that is needed for the creation of that object instance. It completely manages its life cycle. We don't need to manually manage its life cycle. And if there is a need to reusing it, then the Spring will automatically reuse it and destroy it safely. So basically, Spring provides all this type of functionality. So when we add the object instance to the Spring context, it takes the full control and provide different functionality. As we have already seen, the Spring will create the object, inject the required dependency for the creation of that object, manages its life cycle and reuse it if necessary, and then destroy it safely. So these are some of the functionality that are provided by the Spring when we add the object to the Spring context. So we add the object to the Spring context so that we don't manage them manually. Consider, if we don't add the object to the Spring context, then we have to manually manage it and control its life cycle. But once we have added the object to the Spring context, then we don't need to manage its life cycle from the creation to the destruction. All things are managed by the Spring itself. So basically, so now this will be clear to this will be clear to you, like why do we add the object instance to the context? Because until and unless we don't add the object to the Spring context doesn't provide any functionality to us. Spring provide functionality to only those objects that are added to the Spring context. So we can say that the Spring context is like the entry point for the framework. So now we will understand about what is beans, because beans are nothing but the object instance that are added to the Spring context is known as beans. Have you understand? What are beans? The beans are nothing. The object instance that we have added to the Spring context is beans. So bean is basically an object that are added to the Spring context. For example, consider this example. So this is the Spring context and we have added our car object instance to the Spring. Then this object is known as the beans. So beans are nothing. The object instance that are added to the Spring context is known as beans. Have you understand? So beans is nothing. It's a object that are added to the Spring context is known as the beans. Now, what is the difference between the bean and the normal object? So basically, the normal object is created using the new keyword. But Spring, the bean is created by the Spring. We don't need to use the new keyword in order to create some for the bean, as bean are created by the Spring and all the life cycle is managed by the Spring itself. Now the normal object has the manual life cycle. We control the life cycle of the normal object. Our code control its life cycle, but the life cycle of the bean is controlled by the Spring framework. Now in the normal object there is a tight coupling. What is meant by the tight coupling? Tight coupling means that the two classes are heavily dependent on each other. So if we change any code in the first class, then we need to change the code also in the second class. So it means the tight coupling. So in the normal object there is a tight coupling, but in the Spring beans there is a loose coupling. We will see all these examples with the help of practical in the upcoming video. Now the normal object is hard to test, but the Spring beans are easy to test. So these are some of the difference between the normal object and the Spring beans. So normal object is created by the new keyword, but the Spring bean is created by the Spring. Normal object has the manual life cycle, but the Spring bean has the managed life cycle, and it is managed by whom? The Spring framework. The life cycle of the bean is managed by the Spring framework. Now in the normal object there is a tight coupling, that two classes heavily dependent on each other, but in the case of the Spring bean there is a loose coupling due to the dependency injection. Don't worry about what is dependency injection, we will learn it in the next video. So in the normal object, there is a hard to test the normal object, but the Spring Bean is easy to test. So these are some of the difference between the beans and the normal object. So beans is basically an object that is added to the Spring context. So now you will be wondering, okay, I have understand that the Spring context is the place in memory where we add our object, and once the object is added to the Spring context, this is known as the bean, and this is known as the Spring context. So basically, how we can add the new bean to the context? So we can add the new bean to the Spring context in the three ways. First, using the bean annotation. Second one is the using the stereotype annotations, and third one is the programmatically. So there are three ways in which we can add the bean to the Spring context. First one is the using the bean annotation. Second one is the using the stereotype annotations like component, service, controller, repository, and third one is the programmatically. So let's see each one of these. So before learning it, let's see what we are going to understand it with the help of the practical example. So let's see what we want to achieve. So what are the steps of adding a new bean to the Spring context? So first we will create the class whose instance we want to add to the Spring context. Second, we will create the Spring context, and in the third step we will add our object instance to the Spring context. So basically there are three steps. First, we will create our class whose instance object that we want to the Spring context. Second, we will create the Spring context, and third, in the third step we will add our object instance to the Spring context. So let's we will start by independently creating the object of type car and the Spring context, and in the third step we will add it to the car in using the three different ways. First one is the using the bean method, second one is the using stereotype annotation, and third one is the programmatically. So let's see. So first let's start with the using the bean annotations. So using bean annotations. So before starting the bean annotation, let's quickly create our project. So in order to create our project for understanding the bean and the life cycle, we will start with a blank project. So first we will open our IntelliJ IDEA. So we will use the Maven build tool, and let's name it Spring context because we are going to learn about it only. Example, and let's change its location to, let's say, example. Let's choose its location, and let's quick start. We will use the template quick start, and let's okay. Now group ID, artifact ID, and the version, let's keep it default. And if you don't understand what is this, then I have separately covered the complete Maven tutorial in the build tool video. First watch this, and then you will be able to understand this in a greater way. Now let's create it. So now it's downloading something. Let's analyze our pom.xml file. It is our pom.xml file. Now it will take some time. It's downloading something. Now we have created our empty project using the Maven architecture. Now in order to use the Spring context, so in order to add the Spring context in it, so Spring context is the framework of the Spring framework. And as we know that the Spring framework is very modular. By modular I mean that basically we can add only that part that we need instead of adding the whole Spring framework. So Spring context, as the name signifies, is provided by the framework known as the Spring context. So let's add the Spring context in it. So basically in dependency, let's add the, it's from the org dot Spring framework, Spring framework, and artifact ID is Spring context. And let's add the version to, and I will also add the version 5.2.6 dot release. Don't worry, you can basically go to the Spring Maven Center and see the version and the ID related to this. Now it's basically downloading it and it's now completed. Now we have added the Spring context dependencies in our project. Now what are the steps that are required? As I have already shown you what we need to create. First we need to create the Spring class, car class, that whose object instance we want to add to the Spring context. So this is the step 1, and in the step 2 we will create the Spring context, and in the third step we will add the instance of this class to the Spring context. So let's first create our car class. So come to the src folder. I have explained about the folder structure in our build tool tutorial. You can easily refer to that video if you don't understand this folder structure. So basically we will create here Java class, the name car, and let's add some property to it like private string name. Let's only add name because we are going to learn how to add it, and set its getter and setter function. So in order to set a getter and setter function, click on this and press Alt plus Enter. You will see various options. From here you can easily add the getter and setter function. So step 1 is done. We have created the car class whose instance we want to add to the Spring context. So let's see whether it's working or not. So come here and let's create instance of our car class. Car c is equals to new car, and let's set its name to c dot set name, and let's say it to the G wagon, and let's say whether it's working or not, printing c dot get name, and let's see whether it's working fine or not. So basically it's working. So our step 1 is completed. In this step we have created our class whose instance we want to add to the Spring context. In the second step we need to create the Spring context. So how we can create the Spring context? So in order to create the Spring context, we will basically write var context. Let's see how we can create the Spring context. So in order to create the Spring context, we will basically write var. Let's create a new instance of the annotation config application context here. And why it's showing error, let's say click Alt plus Enter. And here so basically a feature of the Java 10 where we can directly use the var variable. So we can directly use the var and context and new annotation config application context. So using this we are creating basically application context, that is the Spring context, using the annotation configuration, annotation config application context. So basically how we have created the context using the following definition. Let's change the color. So basically we have written var context is equals to new. We are creating the new instance of the annotation config. Basically we are configuring the Spring context using the annotation and application context. So in this we have created our the Spring class and the Spring context using this. Now we need to add our this class. We need to add this class to this context. So how we can do that? So we have seen that we can do that using the three methods. So first we will see how can we add using the bean annotations. So let's see how we can add it using the bean annotations. So using the bean annotations, we can add the instance of the class that we define in our project, as well as add the instance of the class that we didn't create ourselves but we use in our app. For example, the instance like integer is a class that we don't define in our class, but we can add its instance to the context also using the bean annotations. And what is mean by the car class that we have created? So we can add the instance of the class defined in our project, like car in our example, and also we can add the instance of class that we didn't create ourselves but we want to use in our app. For example, integer is a class, a string class that we don't create in our app, but still we can add its instance in our app using the bean annotations. So let's see how we can add the bean to the Spring context using the bean annotations. So it can be done basically in the three steps. So first, it can be done in the three steps. First we need to define configuration class annotated with the configuration. So now you will be wondering, like, what are the annotations in Java? So annotations in Java is nothing. Annotations are like the metadata. What are annotations? Annotation is nothing but the metadata. Metadata means the data about the data. So annotation basically provide the information about our code to the compiler, framework. Basically annotation provides some data or information about our class or method to the compiler or framework or the JVM. So basically annotation doesn't affect the execution of the code or its logic. It only provides some information to the Spring context or the JVM, on the basis of which this framework or the JVM takes some necessary or the defined steps. So basically using the bean annotations, so how we can add our add our car instance to the Spring context using the bean annotation. So it can be done in the three steps. First we need to define a configuration class annotated with the configuration. So let's create one configuration class. So let's do our first step. So come here and create one class name project config here, and we will annotate it with configuration capital CONFIU configuration. So basically you can say that it is provided by the Spring framework dependencies that we have added into our project using the pom.xml. So now we have created, so first step is done. First we have defined a configuration class annotated with the configuration. First step is done. In the next step we need to add a method. We need to add a method to the configuration class that we have created. So basically we have created a configuration class. In this we want to add a method that returns, what it will return? The object instance we want to add to the context. So let's see and annotate the method with the bean annotations. So what we want to do? First we have created the configuration class. Now in the configuration class we need to add a method that will return the object instance that we want to add to the context and annotate it with the bean annotation. So let's see step by step. So basically in the project configuration class we have to create one method that will return the object instance. So basically our object is car, so it will return the car, and let's say its name to the car method. And this method should return our instance of that we want to add to the Spring context. So let's first create the instance using the new car. So now its instance is created, and let's set its name to the let's G wagon, or let's here add here context for the context understanding, and return C. And so what does the definition say? First we have to add a method to the configuration class that return the object instance. So what is his here object instance? Here our object instance is the car that we want to add to the Spring context, and annotate it with the bean annotations, and annotate the method with the bean annotations. So let's we have created the method that will return the car type, and let's annotate it with the bean annotation. Okay, now it's done. So step 1 is done. So first step we have created our Spring configuration class, and in the second step we have created a method that will return our car method car instance. In the third step, make Spring use the configuration class defined in the step 1. So basically till now we have created the configuration class, and we have created one method that will return the instance of our class or the object instance. That now how does the Spring will come to know that it is the case? So we need to make the Spring aware of our the configuration class. So basically in the context here we will pass our configuration class project config dot class. So now it's done. So third step is done, because we instruct the Spring how to create the instance of the object using the configuration. So configuration is like how we are instructing the Spring, like how to create the object and which object to be added to the Spring context. Since by default Spring know nothing about any object in our application until and unless we don't add any object to it. So all the step is done. Let's see it's working or not. So let's comment out this code, and let's comment out, and let's car see, and let's context dot get bean, and now in order to retrieve the bean. So basically what we have done, we have added the Spring we have added the Spring context, our object instance in this case is car, to our the Spring context. Now in order to get it from here, we will use one method not known as getBean, and here we will pass our class name. So let's pass here class name. What is our class name? Class name is car dot class. So now, and let's print his name. So now you can see that we are getting the instance that is added to the Spring context. So we have seen that how we can add the instance of the object using the bean annotations. So it can be done in the 3 steps, as we have already seen. In the 3 steps it can be done. First we need to create a configuration class using the configuration keyword. Then we will in this configuration class we need to add one method that will return the object instance we want to add to the context, and with the bean annotation. And we will in the 3rd step we make our Spring application aware of our configuration class by adding the configuration class to the Spring context. So now here you can see that here in the main app.java, this is our entry point of the application. Here we don't create any object by ourselves, but Spring create the object for ourselves using this annotations method. So this is the one method of creating the bean using the bean annotations. So basically this is the step 1. We have created the configuration class, and in this step 2 we have added one method that return the object instance that we want to add to our Spring context. This is step 2. And in the step 3 we make our Spring aware of our the configuration class, like how to create the object instance. So what happened step by step? So when we run the application, Spring first look for our configuration class, and in this it will search for any method that is annotated with the bean annotations. So any method that is annotated with the bean annotation, Spring run this method and add the return value to its context. So basically when the Spring runs, so Spring runs from here, it's first search for go to this configuration class and see the method annotated with the bean, and here it created the new instance of our class and return this, and this returned object instance is added to the Spring context, and now we can get this instance using the .get bean method, and here we will pass our class name car.class. Let's add one or two more beans of different types. So let's now add one annotated with bean, and let's name it integer. Integers class, and let's say it to also integer, and here we will create integer I is equals to let's say 5 and return I. Why this way? And let's create a new bean, and this time the string bean as string, and let's say string s is equals to hello context, and return s. Now let's access all this instance in our here. So basically we can write here, we can write here string s is equals to context dot get bean. First let's string dot class, and in second let's access the integer I using the context dot get bean and integer dot class. Why it's showing error? Oh sorry, here it should be integer, not string. Integer, and let's print all of this. Let's see whether it's working or not. Let's first print the string, second let's print I, and let's say it's working or not. So you can see that it's working. So basically using it we can add as many beans as we want. So what happened initially, the Spring starts, it created the new context. Now the context is initialized with our project config. It search for the project config, and the Spring sees if there is any method in the project configuration class annotated with the bin. Yes, it sees there are 3 methods. It runs all the 3 methods and add the return value to its context. So now you will be wondering like, okay, we are accessing our object instance using the class name, and since there can be more instance of the same class, so how we can access the object more than one object instance of the same class. So in the next topic let's see how we can add more than one object of the same type. So how we can add it? For example, using the car, how we can add the 3 instance of the car class. So let's see how we can do that, adding more bean of the same type into the Spring context, how we can do that this. So let's see how we can add more than one object of the same type. So there is one concept in it. The each object instance in the Spring context is identified with the help of unique identifier known as ID. And what is this ID by default? By default, this ID is of the method name. So the method name is assigned to this. So we can access this instance using the method name that we have created here. So let's see it with the help of example. So let's delete it and create the 3 instance of the car class, and let's see how we can access it. So let's see, we go to project config and let's delete it, and we will create 3 instance of the car class. Let's create, copy it, and we name car1, car2 and car3. So basically when the Spring will run this method and return the its instance to the context, then each object instance will be identified by the unique ID. And what is the name of that object instance? So basically this object instance is identified the car1 name, and this one is identified by the car2, and this one will be identified by the car3. Let's change its name to G-Wagon. Let's say the second car is the Mercedes Benz, and the third one is the, let's name third Audi. Let's see how we can access it. So basically currently what is the scene here? So basically currently we have our, so basically what we have done, we have added the 3 instance of the same type car. So let's see how we can access each one of it. So let's see this will work or not. Basically we are telling the Spring to return the bean from the context of the type car. Let's see what will it do. So let's run it. So as you can see here, it is saying error because, see here, expected single matching bit but found 3. There basically it's saying that we are basically accessing it with the help of the type only, but it will work only if there is one object instance of that type. But basically here there are 3 instances of the same type car class, car1, car2, car3, and Spring is not able to find, because there is an ambiguity, because there are 3 object instance of the type car class present, and we have only specified about the car. So Spring is not able to find which object instance we are referring to. So in that case we need to also, in case of multiple object instance of the same type, we also need to pass the ID that is assigned by the Spring to the each object instance. And what is this ID? This ID is the name of the method that we are using for the object, adding the object instance to the context. So for the G-Wagon, the ID will be the car1. So let's access the G-Wagon. Here we will pass the name with the help of car1, and let's see whether it's working or not. So now when we pass the car1, it's printing the G-Wagon. As you can see, the car1 is the name of the G-Wagon, its ID is the car1. Let's see, and also let's copy it. Let's say it's C1, C2 and C3, and also let's copy it, copy, and here C1, C2, C3, and let's see here we will access the car2, and here we will access car 3. And now you will be no, car 2 will be bin and car 3 will be Audi. Let's see whether it's working or not. Let's print it. So now it's working. First one is the G wagon because we are accessing it with the help of ID. And what is this ID? Car 1. By default, the method name will be assigned to the ID. So basically we can see here that okay, now car 1 is the Mercedes Benz, car 2 is our bin, and car 3 is our Audi. So now let's say you want to change your name of this instance. So we can change the name of the object instance by in the bin, just pass the value is equals to, let's say, G. Now its name will be G, and let's say its name will be bench, and or it's, so this is the default behavior. So let's say we want to change the name of the object instance. So there are three ways. First, we in the bean we pass the value, and let's pass its value to the wagon for, let's say, W for the G wagon. And second way is using the name and pass here, let's say, bench, B for bench. And then the third way is nothing, just pass here, what is it, Audi, A for Audi. Now the name of the object instance is changed. There are three methods. First one by passing the value, name, just directly. So let's access each one of these, W, B and A. So here we will write W, here we will write B, and here we will write A, and let's say whether it's working or not. So now it's working. G wagon, bench and Audi. So basically we can change the name of the instance using the three ways. First one is using the value keyword, second one is the name, and third one is the directly. So let's see, we can change the name in the three ways. Bin, and the first one is using the name, the second one is the value, and third one is directly. As you can see, we can add. So basically the Spring gives the ID, unique ID to each the object instance added to the context, and this name can be modified using these three keywords. By default, the method name will be assigned to its ID. Now you understand how we can add more than one object of the same type. Now let's see about the how we can define the primary bins. And what are the primary bins? So basically primary bins are used when we have multiple bin of the same type and we don't specify any name. Spring will use it by default using the primary annotations. So how we can define the primary? So suppose we have more than one, suppose here in the Spring context we have more than one instance of the same type, let's say car, and we do, while getting the bin context.get bin, we don't specify the name of the bin. So how will the Spring will know? So Spring will by default return the primary bins. So how we can define the primary bin? Using the primary annotation. Let's see it with the help of example. So basically here we have three instances of the same type, car, and let's say here we are basically car default of, let's say, primary. And here we will get context dot get bin, and here we will only pass the car dot class, and let's see what it will print. And let's comment out these codes, and let's say s out primary dot get name, and let's see. So currently we haven't defined any primary, and if we run it, it will give us error. As you can see, no qualifying bin of the type org.example.car available, expected signal per matching 3 bin found, W, B and A. But let's say we define this Mercedes Benz as a primary bin. So now, and if we run this now, so basically the Benz is written by the Spring context. So what does the primary bin does? So basically, if in our context, if there are more than one bin of the same type, and while accessing it we don't pass any and while accessing it we don't pass any id, then by default the Spring will return the primary bin. So now you have understand it. So now let's, so this is all about the how we can add this bin to the Spring context using the bin annotations. Now let's see the second method of adding the bin to the Spring context, and that is using the stereotype annotations. So the bin can be added to the Spring context using the stereotype annotation in the two ways. First, use the component annotations, mark the class where you want to add the instance to its context, and use component scan annotation over the configuration class. Instruct the Spring on where to find the classes you marked. So it can be done in the second two steps. Let's see how we can do it. So basically, so let's add this example only. So basically what we need to do, we don't need, we just have to add here component and the project config class. We don't need to add this much information. We just, so first our first step is completed. We want to add the object instance of this class to our Spring context. So basically we have written here component and the project config class, and if we run it, let's see, comment out all this, and let's comment out all this, cut, comment this. If currently, now we have added the component annotation to the here, and now we need to tell our Spring application where to look for the classes that is marked with the annotations. So we specify it with the help of component scan, and here we pass the base package, and here we will pass our package name. In this example, org.example is our package name. Example, org.example is our package name. So what it is telling that? It is telling the Spring, hey Spring, go to this package and find any class that is marked with component and add its instance to the context. Now let's see whether it's working or not. So basically we have written the wrong spelling. So now let's see whether it's working or not. So using the bin annotation, currently it's working and it's printing the null, because what does the Spring does? So first when we run this, now Spring first created the instance of the Spring. First it's created the Spring context using the project config class. It's go to the project config class, Spring search, okay, so we have Spring knows that it has to go to org.example and find all the classes that are annotated with the stereotype annotation. So he found this class is with the stereotype annotation and created its object and added to the Spring context. But why we are getting null? Because Spring created this object instance using the constructor, and we haven't defined any constructor that says anything. So basically let's create one constructor and set the name to, let's say bench, and now it should work. And now you can see that it's working. So how we can add the object using the stereotype annotations? So basically the instance of the class that we want to add to the Spring context, just go to that class and mark it with the component annotations, and in the project config class remove all the annotation and add one component scan and add the base packages to the package in which our class is, whose instance we want to add to the Spring context. So this is the second way of adding the Spring context object instance to the Spring context. This is the second method. Now you will be looking like, okay, so this is the easy way of adding this bin to the Spring context. Why there is a need of that bin annotations? This is much fine. There is less boilerplate code in this. Just create the normal class, add the component annotation at the top of it, and add configuration and add component scan and type the base packages. Then why there is need of bin annotations? So each one of these has separate exam use cases, and we will see when to use which annotations. So basically, so before going to that point, let's see what are the different things, different annotations that we can use here. So component is basically a generic annotation. Here we can also use the service. So basically we can also add here service annotation, and if we run it, it will work fine. So these are the just different annotations of the same thing. So service is basically service. So basically we use the service annotation for those class that provide some business logic to our code. And third one is the repository. If any class that done with the database, then we use the repository. Third one is the controller. We can also use the controller, and if we run it, then also it will work. So these are the different annotations, and all this work the same way, but we add it here for basically better understanding or better verbose for the developer. So what are the common stereotype annotation? So first one is the component is a generic one. Second one is the service, and the service is used for if it provide any business logic. Third one is the repository annotation. Third one is the controller. We can use any one of this, but there are convention like we should use the repository annotation for those classes which deal with the database, and we should use the controller annotation for that deals with the HTTP request. So these are some of the common stereotype annotations that we use. Now let's see what are the difference between the bean annotations. So this is the step one. What in the step one we mark the class whose instance we want to add using the component scan, and in the second step we should add the component scan and add our package. Here we have used, in our example, it is org.example. Now let's see what are the difference between the bean annotations versus the stereotype annotations. So what are the difference between both of them? So let's see. So the first difference is the bean annotation and the stereotype annotations like @component, @repository, service. So first difference is clearly visible that the bean annotation is marked on the method, and the stereotype annotation is marked on the class, as we can see here. The bean annotations here, we have seen that the stereotype annotation is marked on the class, but the bean annotation that we define is defined on the class, like here bean and like that. Second one is the object creation logic. So using the bean annotations, the object creation logic is written by the developer, but in the stereotype annotation it is handled by the Spring. For example, here the annotations that we have used earlier, let's rewrite, let's like here we can the object creation logic. Here the object creation logic is written by the developer in the bean annotations, as you can see in our examples. But in the stereotype annotation, the object creation logic is handled by the Spring using the constructor. As we can see here, we using the stereotype annotations, we don't have the freedom of creating the object. So using the bean annotation, we can create any number of instances of using the bean annotation we can create any number of instances of the same class, more than one instance of the same one. But using the stereotype annotation, we can create only one annotation per class, and it is handled by the Spring framework. Because when we mark any class with the component, Spring create the instance of this object and add it to the Spring context. But only one instance of that class is added using the stereotype annotation. We cannot add more than one instance of the same class using the stereotype annotations. Only one instance per class using the stereotype annotations. But using the bean annotations, we can add more than one instance of the same type. Now, bean is best for the external libraries, external classes, or third-party classes. For example, if we are using like integer class, so basically it is the class, or like array list. Array list is a class that we haven't defined in our project, but it is provided by someone else. So how we can go to that class and add the our stereotype annotation? So for all these types of class, our bean annotation is best, because simply go to the configuration, type the bean, and here simply type the type that we want to return, like array list. Here array list, type object creation logic and return here. But using the stereotype annotations, we cannot go to that class and mark the component or service annotation in this. So which one is best? So bean annotation is best for the external or third party classes, and the stereotype annotation is best for application classes that are defined in our project, because we can go to that class and simply mark that class with the help of our stereotype annotation, and Spring will create the instance of that object and add to the Spring context. Now using the bean annotation, we have full control over the instantiation of our object. Like we can fully control what our object creation for the object creation, we have full control. But in the stereotype annotation, we have the limited control. We can only Spring will instantiate that object for us using the constructor. So we have limited control using the stereotype annotations. So these are some of the difference between the bean annotation versus the stereotype annotations. So now you have to understand that we will use the bean annotation if we want to add the more than one instance of the same class. Then we will use the bean annotations. But if we want to add in only one instance of the object that are defined in our own application, then we will use the stereotype annotations. Now let's go to the third way of adding the bean to our context, that is programmatically. So let's see how we can add the bean to our project programmatically. How we can add the bean programmatically. So first see why there is need of a programmatically. Why there is a need of adding the bean to our Spring context programmatically. So basically this approach is used when we want to add the bean to the context based on some condition at the runtime, and these conditions are derived from, let's say, API call or from database operations. So in that cases, we will use the programmatically way of adding the Spring object instance to the Spring context. Let's say, consider this case. For example, consider this case. If some condition, then register this bean, and if that condition is not met, then register this bean. So this type of condition, this types of object instantiation and adding to the Spring context is not supported by our traditional stereotype or the bean annotations. That's why there is need of programmatically adding. So what is the syntax of adding the beans programmatically to our Spring context? So basically, when there is a program running in our code, and our code will decide based on certain condition which beans to register. So let's say, so how we can do this? So based on certain conditions, that bean will be registered. So let's see what is the syntax. So we will use the context instance and use the register bean method of the context class and give the name. So what is the name? So basically here is our Spring context. string context, and let's say here is our car. So here is our car. My drawing is very bad. Don't focus on drawing. Focus on concept, guys. So what is the name? So name here is the name that is given to the this object instance, and we can use this name to extract to get this object instance from the context. Second one is the class for which we want to add, and second one is the class for which whose instance we want to add to the string context. And third one is the supplier function or supplier that define how to create the object. It will define how to create the object. So supplier is nothing. Supplier is basically a functional class that supplier is nothing but it's simply defined. It simply return something. It take nothing and return something. So let's see how we can programmatically register the bean in our string context. So we have seen the syntax, and let's see how we can do that. So let's erase all these configurations. Okay, we have removed it. Remove the controller, remove the string annotation, and now we have our project. And now if we currently try to run it, then it will give error because there is no any class. So now let's say okay, now let's say based on some condition different bean will be registered in our program. So let's say we define one scanner object, and we will take scanner new scanner system dot n, and we will let's say int I is equals to sc dot next end. And let's say if I is equal to 0, we will register a different bean, and else we will register the different beans. Let's say if this is the case, then we will register different bean context dot register bean, and here first we will pass the name of the bean, and that will be going to be the let's say car. Second one is the class for which we want to car dot class, and third one is this we will define how to create the class. So return new car, and let's say we created car, c1 is equals to new car, and set his name to c1 dot set name, and set its name to let's say car 0 because it is the 0 part. And why it's saying missing return. Okay, and what we want to return it, let's return it, return c1. Let's now, and if the input is not 0, then we will register a different bean. Let's say for the purpose only where I am showing to you its name, we will say the same name car because we want to see the difference, and here we will say the car one. And now let's access this. So context car c is equals to context dot get bean, and only we need to pass the car dot class, and let's print it c dot get name, and let's see whether it's working or not. First we will ask for a number. Let's say the number is 0. Now you can see that based on the runtime condition, if the value of I is 0, then this context is running. So first we have given the name of the bean, and second one is the class, and third one is the supplier that define how to create the bean. So it is basically a lambda expression and supplier that supply how to create the bean. So if the value of I is 0, then its name is 0, car 0. But if the value of I is not 0, then this bean will be registered. Let's see. Currently we've passed this 0 and this bean will get registered. This is only for the example purposes. And let's say now I pass it 2. Now car 1 get printed because this bean get registered. So this is the programmatically way of adding the bean to the Spring context. So now let's revise. So let's revise what we have learned in this. So this brings us to the end of the video. So in the next video, let's have a quick recap, guys. So in this video, in today's video, we have first started with what is the Spring context. So we have seen that a Spring context is nothing but a Spring context is a place in the memory where all the object managed by the Spring is stored. So basically what is the context? Context is nothing but a place in the memory where all the object that is managed by the Spring is stored here and provided different functionalities to it. And then we have learned about what is the beans. So beans are nothing but the bean. What are the beans? Beans is the object that is added to the Spring context is known as the bean. So what are bean? Then we have learned about the bean. So bean is nothing but the object that is added to the Spring context is known as bean. Next, we have learned about how we can add the object instance to the Spring context. So we have learned about the 3 methods. So first using the bean annotation, second one is the stereotype annotation, and third one is the programmatic way. So we have seen that in bean method we can add the object instance to the Spring context using in the 3 steps. First we define the project configuration class. In the second step we create a method that return the instance that we want to add to the Spring context, and the third we add this project configuration file to our Spring context. In second method we have learned about the stereotype annotation and how we can add the Spring object instance to the Spring context using the stereotype annotation. So first basically for the class whose instance I want to add to the Spring context, go to that class and mark it with the stereotype annotation like component, and go to the project configuration class and write here component scan and specify the package where its Spring should look for your stereotype class. And third one we have seen about programmatic way of adding the Spring object instance to the Spring context using the context.register bean. And also we have learned about what is the difference between this bean annotation and the stereotype annotation and when to use this. So in the bean annotation we can add more than one instance of the same type, but using the stereotype annotations we can add only one instance of a single type. Also using the bean annotation we have a full freedom of the object creation, and the object creation is handled logic of the object creation is handled by the developer. On the other hand, using the stereotype annotation the object creation is handled by the Spring and we don't have the freedom of the object creation. So this is all the concept that we have learned in today's video. So what do you need to do now? So in the description of this video you will be getting one quiz. Go to that quiz and attempt that quiz and try to do all the coding by yourself that I have shown you with the help of example, and try to do experiment with it. So in the next video we will be understanding about what is the dependency injection and different methods of dependency injection. And the next video we will learn about the bean lifecycle and the scopes. So thank you guys.